a little sideline that I developed in my first year of work there. They decided that I had the right kind of English voice from the resonance point of view and the accent point of view for broadcasting coded messages to agents on special radio equipment. And I used to be taken off about once every 10 days to read. I can't remember the code now, but it went like Alpha, Kilo, and various things like that, a well-known letter code. And I used to recite these things. This went on for, I can't remember how much, the best part of a year, and then it stopped. So I said, oh, I see I'm not being taken for my couple of hours outing to make my little broadcast, which lasted 6 or 7 minutes each time. And they said, no, we've computerized your voice and we cut it up and we use it without you being present and without your permission. I don't know for how long, and until other forms of communication were developed, this was used. So I don't think I'm mentioned in any of the espionage history books for this particular item, but it was fun. I'll mention something about my good fortune. My good fortune was that I was usable for headquarter work and or field work. And this went on for many years. Some of my colleagues, for reasons best known to themselves or their superiors, were considered suitable for one or the other. I certainly wasn't the only one who was interchangeable in being used, but this was great fun and this was very good. While I was out abroad for 4 years in a European country, I had a close friend who was much older than I, and he was in charge of a field called preparing commercial covers for foreign agents and for our own people. Many of these covers were quite superficial, and you could manage with a letter saying that you were the representative of the firm and so on. And sometimes you needed it deeper than that for a man who was going back to his own country, say an Arab country. A lot of Jews, in all countries of Europe helped with this. For reasons which are perhaps parochial and personal, 50% of these covers were from Britain, from British Jews. I don't think there was ever one slip-up in approaching a British Jew. It was, I've already told you about what their reaction was. I mean, I had one man, a good level-headed businessman, whom I went to see after work. He had a big firm with several partners and employees, and I told him what I wanted. So he started opening drawers and bringing out the headed notepaper of several of his commercial companies and said, here, take the blanks, do what you like with them. It's not really important whether I see what you do with them or not, because if something comes through, you'll let me know, and I shall give the backing I need. And then he got enthusiastic. He got the keys to all of his colleagues' rooms, started opening their locked desks and bringing out their headed notepaper covers, papers of the firms that they were in charge with. It was a very big conglomerate. And he was rushing around like mad. And I already quite enough, and I thought, he's marvelous in a way, but he's getting overexcited about it. And anyway, he collected me and gave me a collection of about 15 sets of headed notepaper of various commercial companies which I could certainly use. I didn't use a tenth of them in the course of the time. Anyway, we had a lot of people who were prepared to help in this way. We had even one man who was so competent and so well trusted that he built up the contact in his country with an Arab diplomat, a contact which we used firstly through him and afterwards without him. There were Jews who did wonderful things in all countries, but I had particular pleasure from compatriots from England who were wonderful. Okay. Oh, by the way, this particular job was great from a personal point of view. It was a one-man show, and I did it for 2 years, and I planned my week's work independently. I wrote my own timetable through my administrative colleagues in my branch in the embassy, booked my flights, got my cash for the journeys and for anything else I needed, and informed the superior that I would be away from this day to that day. I very often tried to get back on Friday as much as possible, and I fixed my own timetable. Nobody wanted an immediate report at what I'd done, how I'd done it, how much time I'd spent here or there or everywhere. In effect, they could check with me, but I was given that authority, which was a very pleasant way of working, because most of the jobs you're very much tied up with the reporting, especially when you're working abroad. Okay, what can I tell you now? Okay. Right. I've told you that I worked mainly not as an Israeli in Europe. And I've told you about how wonderful the Jews were who cooperated. As little sidelines while I was abroad, I had to purchase and or rent properties in various countries, and they liked to have some of these properties in the name of a British citizen, in a genuine name or not a genuine name, according to the needs. And I had quite a few properties in my name in my time. The last one I disposed of quite a few years after I'd already finished service in the government, in the organization. I also developed know-how, or collected know-how, on how to make money transfers at the time when in Europe there were strict rules about what you could transfer abroad and what evidence you had to give for transferring abroad. And very often I would travel from one country to another country where I knew it would be easier and less questions asked for forwarding money to an agent in an Arab country. I don't say I spent a great deal of time on this, but I did it fairly often and fairly regularly while serving in Europe. Okay. When I got back to Israel, my job was security of operations. Operations being, in nearly all cases, those taking place abroad of my particular department. There were other departments with which we had no information or contact about what they were doing and how they were doing it. There was a division. So I would supervise from very little going out into the field to check on people or operations, but from my desk, and quite often I would be at odds with the people running the operation in headquarters. I would give my opinion that such and such a thing was not advisable security-wise from in this operation, and they would go ahead with it. There were other cases when they would say this is too risky, and I would give my well-based opinion that there was no risk in it at all, and as a security officer they should take my word for it, it was fine. Interplay like this. Now there is a division in the intelligence community between who is responsible for work in Israel and who is responsible for work abroad. My organization is responsible for work abroad. The Shin Bet and the military intelligence are responsible for work in Israel and on Israeli borders. Because of our expertise in certain fields, the sub-department which I was running at the time had an arrangement with the Shin Bet, the Sherut Bitachon, which enabled us to deal and contact foreign visitors, be they sailors, businessmen traveling between Arab countries and Europe and dropping in Israel on the way. And I was running a large sub-department dealing with these visitors. First of all, we had to get information that they were there, and there were, I don't like to think of the many thousands who I should have contacted had I known of their existence, who were passing through Israel, some of whom must have had marvelous contacts that we never knew of, we didn't use. I'll break here just to say that there's a question of how a person who tries to abide by the halachic rules of life manages in this kind of work. There is a concept called pikuach nefesh, which covers practically everything, and we used to get from time to time, every few years, the blessing of the chief army Rav for almost anything we wanted that we considered was necessary to do, whether it was Shabbat, circumventing or ignoring the rules of kashrut, and so on. I had one young colleague who was very fastidious and punctilious about this problem, and I had to send him every 3 weeks out on Friday night to meet someone on Shabbat, and he had to travel. And he wouldn't rely on this general cover. He used to phone the chief Rav of the army before every journey and say, "It's happened again. I've got to go out on Friday night. Is it all right?" He always got the green light, but he insisted on checking every time before he went out. I never bothered to check. I used my own discretion at these things. It was particularly the case when serving abroad. There had to be a duty officer at night ready to go in to deal with anything that cropped up in the telegrams from the headquarters, had to go into the embassy. and it wasn't in walking distance, and I used to drive there, and there is a theory that says I should stay there and then until the end of Shabbat, but that didn't apply because I had to be at home, because I was on call at my telephone at home for anything else that I might be required to attend to. One or two senior colleagues said, why don't you change your place on the rota? You could find some people whom it doesn't bother them at all to go out and travel on a Friday night. And I, being a, what's the word for it? A selfish prig, said, I wouldn't let them have the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh if I can have it. So I wouldn't swap with them. In later years, I thought, you were a bit of a louse. And then about 3 months ago, we had a series of lectures on a Shabbat on pikuach nefesh. And to my pleasant surprise, I found that my selfishness had been correct, and that I had done what the halacha expected of me, and not passed it off to someone else. I was quite pleasantly surprised, and that information reached me about 3 or 4 months ago. Okay, what can I tell you about danger? It's true that 2 of my colleagues were shot in Europe at the time I was there. They were dealing with, they were Arabists, and they were dealing with Arab objectives. One of them survived and one of them didn't. I was never in that kind of position. The only, you can call it a dangerous position I was in a country in a cover disguise, not as an Israeli, and I woke up one morning, the curtains were open, and I thought, this is very odd. What are those things flying past the window over my head? And it appeared that they were bullets. So I got up, looked out of another window, and in the main square, one of the main squares, I could see from another window, a side window, there were 10 tanks. This country had been invaded by a neighboring country, and there was a crisis and there was a curfew. My contact at the embassy of the country I was in slipped round during a break in the curfew and told me that that day or the day after I would be evacuated. And the evacuation authority was British. A British plane was being sent to get out all the expatriates of every nationality from that place, or as many as could be loaded up and rounded up. So I thought, this is rather nice, I'm going to get a free trip to London. But I wasn't allowed to use the passport, any passport I had. I was given a sort of like a laissez-passer, a temporary Israeli passport, and I had to choose the name for it. And I chose the name Aryeh ben Hoshea. And it transpired that the news services in Israel read a list of the Israelis who were about to be repatriated and saved. And that name appeared in the list. And my clever, no longer with us, wife spotted the name and realized that it was I, which I thought was very bright. It didn't really matter because the office was telling her, my office was telling her that I was all right, and there was contact with me anyway. But she heard it over the radio as well.
Hoshea was your dad's name?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Hoshea was my late father's name, so she knew. Okay, That's for danger. I don't think, looking back on it and looking at the time, I don't think that I was in danger in any other sense, in any other time.